I know when to cut. Good evening and welcome to Pursuing Gold. And I'm your host, Gail Strange. Well, we finally gotten some rain and I am so happy because it has been absolutely so hot outside. But in all the heat and now the rain and the hurricanes and everything that's going on, you know what? God still provides for us. And today's lesson is God's provision during a pandemic. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that's the opening line of Charles Dickens' novel, which was published way back in 1859, A Tale of Two Cities. The story is set in the late 18th century against the background of the French Revolution, and it's the story of London and the revolutionary Paris. The book, which is driven by political events, offers scenes of large-scale mob violence, and in the book, Dickens lambasts both aristocratic tyranny and revolutionary access. Now, this was 1859, and today is 2020. But the scenario sounds a whole lot like the same story. And our city and our country today is much like a tale of two cities, a tale of two countries, where you have the haves and the have-nots. You have the wealthiest 1% having more money than the whole 90% of the country. And so we get concerned when we hear these numbers. Let's take a look at our state of the nation now. There's roughly about 1.3 million Americans who filed for the first time for unemployment benefits just last week. And according to the U.S. Department of Labor, if you add the 1 million pandemic claims filed by the gig economy and those related workers, we're looking at an alarming 2.3 million Americans who sought unemployment assistance again just last week. And so nearly 50 million people have now filed for the first time unemployment benefits over the last 16 weeks. And this is a stark contrast to the 10 plus years of successive uninterrupted job gains that ended at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know for Black Americans, that is not the story. But the bulk of the June job gains were not newly created roles, but rather they were businesses rehiring employees who had been previously furloughed or even laid back, and so they were bringing them back. So the data, as dire as it is, it still doesn't tell the entire story. We've seen overwhelming reports indicating that the economy continues to crumble and it's not likely to get any better anytime soon. Raphael Bostic, who is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta, said, "There is a real sense that this might go on longer than we had hoped, expected, and planned for. People are getting nervous again. Business leaders, they're getting worried. Consumers are getting worried. And the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's latest CFO survey found that businesses don't anticipate returning to pre-pandemic employment levels until the end of 2021. And so the dire outlook from America's top CEOs is reinforced by reporting that about 50% of the population is without a job. And the extra $600 weekly unemployment payments provided by the federal government, well, they're slated to stop at the end of this month. Would that be day after tomorrow or 3 days from today? This will place many of those families who already find themselves in precarious positions, especially as study shows that America's they lack a 3-month supply of emergency money. And so it's really a rough patch and a rough time for this country. We're living in unprecedented times, but as bad as things are, as many people as are out of work, we hear that there's actually 4 million or 4 million plus cases now of the pandemic, of the coronavirus that have impacted people. Here in this country alone, we're closing in on 150,000 people who have died from this virus. And as horrible as all of that is, we need to know that God still provides, and even in the time of COVID-19. Though the scripture for today's study comes from Genesis 22, and it reads, "Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.' So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. He took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then, on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you.'" I want you to remember what I just said here. "And we will come back to you." So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father?" And he said, "Here I am, son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering." So the 2 went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord, and as Sister Geneva always says, you got to watch those butts. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." So he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay a hand on that lad or do anything to him for now. I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said, to this day, the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. Quite a bit of story. And if you think about it, it's like, you want me to do what, Lord? And I think that's some of the questions that perhaps Abraham would have asked. So let's go back to the beginning of the story. We know the story of Sarah and Abraham left Ur in Mesopotamia because God called him to find a new nation in an undesignated land that he would later learn was Canaan. And he obeyed unquestionably the commands of God, from whom he received repeated promises and a covenant that his seed would inherit the land. But Abraham and Sarah didn't receive the promise of a son right away. In fact, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born, and Sarah was 90 when she gave birth to him. But after Isaac grew into a young manhood, God tested him, and he tells him, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you." Now, this is quite a challenge. After taking all these years to finally get the child that God had promised to this couple, God is now telling them to sacrifice the child. Now, I'm the mother of one and one only child, and that one and one only child is a son. So I only have one child, and he's my son. But I can't imagine making a sacrifice like this. But the promise of God led Abraham to believe that Isaac must live, and the command of God led Abraham to believe that Isaac must die. So can you obey the command of God and still get the promise of God? And so that's something that we're going to look at as we explore this lesson further. This is the ultimate test of a person's faith, the ultimate test of Abraham's faith and his loyalty. The place where this sacrifice was to occur is described simply as the region of Moriah. But 2 Chronicles 3:1 identifies the Temple Hill in Jerusalem as Mount Moriah. So early the next morning, Abraham sets off with his two servants and his son Isaac to the designated spot. And it's about a 3-day journey. So when they leave Beersheba to get to Jerusalem, like I said, it's about 3 days. And on the 3rd day, Abraham instructs his servants to wait there while he and Isaac went ahead. And again, he says, "We will worship, and then we will come back to you." You know, this might be one of the best formulas for our lives. And so Abraham knew what was coming. Abraham knew what God had told him to do. He knew what he was supposed to do. So when we're facing a known crisis in our lives, you know, worshiping might be our way, the best way to cope with that, because, you know, we need to learn how to worship God in spite of the crisis. We need to learn how to worship God because of the crisis. When we know that there is something that's just catastrophic coming our way, God is still good and God still provides. And so all we have to do is recognize that, as hard as that may be, and worship God. And so at this point in time, Isaac's age really isn't given, but Isaac is old enough and he's strong enough to carry the wood for the burnt offering on his back. So when it says, "So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together." So can't you imagine Isaac at this point? Isaac is asking his father, "Where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham gives a profound answer. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering." So the two of them went together. Now I'm going to ask you a question. Do you teach your children, your child, your grandchildren that God will provide, no matter how dire the circumstances. Our trust in God has to be complete, and it has to be honest. And so today, these kids think that money grows on trees in the backyard. And so in this microwave society that we live in every day, every single day, we see it, we want it, bam, boom, thank you, ma'am, make it happen. It's readily available. So I gave you the statistics about employment. So we must teach our children to recognize, and we ourselves must recognize, that God will provide. We may not have everything that we want, but God gives us what we need. And so when they arrived at the spot, Abraham had to explain what was about to happen and why. Now, I would only imagine that that's probably the most difficult conversation a parent could ever have with their child. And so how devastating do you think it was that Abraham arranges the wood, he then bounds Isaac. Now remember, I said Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So at this point, he's even older than 100, and he and Isaac are up here by themselves. So Isaac could have resisted, but instead, he willingly gave himself, just as Jesus voluntarily offered himself as our sacrifice. And when we obey God and follow God completely, we have to do it in a willing spirit, and it can't be halfway. It has to be all the way 110%. You got to be in the game. And in this case, Isaac truly had skin in the game. Philippians 2:8 says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death of the cross. So let's take a look at the sacrifice. The sacrifice was a challenge to Abraham, and the challenge Abraham faced was to put his only son on the altar. What God, with a small g, do you have before God? And we all put some things before God. But whatever it is that we're putting in front of God, we need to let it go. And this was just not some willy-nilly kind of sacrifice. This sacrifice cost Abraham. And if it doesn't cost you anything, it's not a sacrifice. If it doesn't hurt, then it's not a sacrifice. So to make a sacrifice, something has to hurt. And can you imagine the hurt that Abraham must have felt when he knows that he's about to put his one and only son that took all these years for him and Sarah to actually have, to death? But that's the kind of commitment that we have to make and must make to God. Now, let's look at Abraham's compliance. Abraham didn't stagger. He was prompt. He went to sleep. He didn't toss and turn all night. He was determined to do what God wanted him to do. Do you have that same kind of resolve? Do you have that same kind of close relationship with God to know that if God is telling me to do this, this is the thing I need to do? And that requires us to sit down, to shut up, and to listen to God. And I think this whole pandemic thing has just been ideal for that, because certainly we can't go anywhere. We can't do anything. I know I'm sitting at home in my office working and looking out at the park, looking at the birds and at the flowers, but I can't go shop like I used to. I can't go to brunch like I used to. I can't do the things that I used to do because this pandemic has said, slow your roll. So that has given me the perfect opportunity. It's given all of us the perfect opportunity to just sit and to commune with God and to listen to what he's telling us. Because in 1 Samuel 15, 22, it tells us, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. So we just need to be in compliance with God's will for our lives. And now let's look at the confidence of Abraham. And I love this because what it says is that Abraham went to worship God. And then he says, tells his servants, you stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship. And what does he say? We will come back to you. Now that's not a I will come back to you, or we might come back to you, or we'll come back later. But Abraham is showing this confidence that he has in his faith in God, because he knows that God is true to his word, and he has shown him over and over how true he is to his word. And so Abraham says, we will come back to you. So let's look at Isaac, the son. Isaac was working. He wasn't just sitting there. He was actually a part of the whole thing, because he carried the wood on his back. And he was wondering, so what's up with this, Daddy? He asked his father, where's the lamb? You've got everything together for a sacrifice, but I don't see a lamb. Can you imagine what's going through Isaac's head? The nerves, the fear, the mistrust, the questioning. But Isaac was also willing. And he could have resisted. Like I said, Abraham was old. He could have knocked Abraham down and said, you on your own. This is not happening. But he didn't. So Abraham picked up the knife and raised his arm to slay his son. And at that instant, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And he responded, here I am. And so when God calls your name, have you responded? Have you taken the time to say, here I am, to find out what God really wants from you, to let God know that you trust him implicitly? And in this time that we're living in, when so many people are out of work, when so many people are sick, when we see so much going on, can you truly say that all of this is in God's hands and that you trust him implicitly? Because we know that he will provide. And then he told him, do not lay a hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And if you think about this, this sounds like somebody else who did not withhold their only son from us. But Abraham's faith was shown to be real, and not just by his words, but instead by his actions. And James 2:2 tells us his faith was made complete by what he did. You got some stuff going on. You don't know how you're going to pay the bills. You don't know how you're going to put uniforms on your kids, and hopefully our kids won't have to go back to school and we won't have to worry about buying new uniforms. But how am I going to pay my mortgage when I don't have a job? How am I going to pay my car note? My insurance is about to be canceled again because I don't have a job, and they're doing all kind of things with the Affordable Health Care Act. Where do you put your faith? What do you do in times like that? It's then that your faith has to be made complete by what you do, by the actions you take, rather than the moaning and the groaning and the woe is me attitude that you take. Abraham put his faith in action. He looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. He sacrificed it as the burning offer instead of Isaac. Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." Now, it's important that we remember what this says, what he called this place. The Lord will provide. You know, there's a lot of prosperity preaching, name it and claim it, just ask and you'll receive. All of that, you know, we as Christians, we can't pay attention to the prosperity gospel because to those that teach it is never God's will for his children to suffer, or that all suffering is an indication of God's displeasure, Genesis 22 clearly points out that true faith must be proved and must be proven by our trials. Certainly, this would be anybody's most severe challenge. And certainly it was Abraham's most severe challenge, because even with the relationship and the closeness that Abraham had to God, for God to ask him to do this, I think I would have been saying, "God, are you serious? Do you mean this? What are you asking me to do?" But in God's wise and good providence, Abraham was called upon to endure the most heart-rending challenge that any man would ever have to face. And so your faith must be proved, and it's proven only when it's put to the test. And there's an adage that says, a tea bag is simply a tea bag until it's put in hot water. And when the tea bag is put into hot water, and especially with all the flavored teas and everything that we have now, that's when the true flavor and the true strength of the tea comes out. However, the primary thing that I want us to see in this chapter is not Abraham's trial, but it's God's provision. And so verse 14 says, "And Abraham called the name of the place, 'The Lord will provide.' And as it is said to this day, 'In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided.'" And in the King James Version it says, "And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh. As it is said to this day, 'In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen.'" Now, this is the name which God revealed himself to Abraham, and it can be translated in three ways. The Lord will see, the Lord will provide, and the Lord shall be seen. Now, the Lord will see tells us that the Lord will see our great need. He constantly sees the needs of his children and provides for them. The provision of the ram to die instead of Isaac was a significant type that before Abraham's eyes, when he called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh. And John 8:56 says, our Lord tells us that Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it was glad. Surely, if Abraham saw Christ's day and was made to rejoice for it, it was at that moment when the Lord provided a substitute for Abraham. So just think of all the anxiety and the stress that Abraham was going through. And so if anybody was happy to see the Lord see their issues, to see their great need at that point in time, immediately it was Abraham. And then the second translation of this term is that the Lord will provide. This lets us know that if God sees our needs, his provision is sure. Have you ever just did not know how you were going to make ends meet, or you got a bad doctor's report, or just something terrible happened to you, and you were about to lose everything that you had. They were about to foreclose on your house. And you had walked the floors all night, you had cried, and you had prayed, and out of nowhere, God comes through. I remember once, I was on a flight from New York to Las Vegas, I believe. And then on my way home, back from Vegas, my face just kept tingling. It just kept tingling. And I had no clue what was going on. I'm like, am I having a stroke? Now, you know, it's not a quick flight from Vegas to Louisville. But I prayed, and a friend of mine, I called her when I got home, and she showed up at my door. And it was about 1 o'clock in the morning at that time. And we went to the emergency room. But I was scared to even drive because I thought, if I'm having a stroke, I don't want to drive and wreck or, make things worse. But God provided what I needed in that friend to be there with me and to talk me through it. And I actually had Bell's palsy, the very beginning of Bell's palsy. And to this day, I've never had anything. Bell's palsy is one of those kinds of conditions that it can actually affect your appearance. It can make you look like you've actually had a stroke with the droopy eyes and the droopy mouth and that sort of thing. But God provided what I needed through my friend and got me to the hospital, where I did not have and still have never had any symptoms or anything that shows that I had actually had Bell's palsy. And that's how God provides for us when we need it and what we need. And this was Abraham's, when the Lord provided this for Abraham, provided the ram for Abraham, this was his testimony to the goodness and grace of God in providing a ram to take the place of his son. Isaac was literally on the altar of sacrifice, but God's provision on the mount was made spontaneously. And while this is seen as a spontaneous provision, the provision God makes is always, not sometimes, not maybe, but it's always the very thing we need when we need it. And then the last interpretation is the Lord will be seen. So when we look at this pandemic and we look at what's going on, we know that God will be seen, and he will be seen on the Mount of Sacrifice. He will be seen in the gospel of Christ. He will be seen in our mount of trials. And when our trials seem so severe that we don't know what to do, we don't have to despair or fret. Because in our darkest hours, in our very darkest hours, the Lord will be seen. The Lord will be seen in the person of Jesus Christ, our substitute. And the substitute will give us our provision, he will give us our purpose, and he will give us a picture that we can't see, but he can show it to us. And so when you think about this, we think that this is all about what Abraham's faith meant and, what was going on with Isaac. But this whole lesson focuses on the mere fact that in our time of need, God will always, always be there to provide for us. And so a substitutionary death means something or someone is acting or serving in the place of another. The gift of the Lord Jesus Christ as our substitute is a provision that secures all other provisions. For God to see is for God to provide. You know how we sometimes say, I will see to it that it happens? when you mean I will take care of it or I will provide for it. You know, we tell our friends, oh, girl, I got your back. I'll help you. Don't worry about that. I'll take care of it. I'll provide that. Well, that's exactly what God did. He saw our need for a Savior, and He provided for that need through His Son. And because God is who God is, He will provide for us. So during this economic catastrophic time of the coronavirus pandemic and the systemic and overt racism and oppression, there's one thing that I want to remind you, that God is a God that can never fail. He will never go back on His word, and that He is with us even until the end of the earth. And so when we have a need, God will provide. No matter what that is, if we sincerely pray and ask Him, God will provide our need. And He knows our needs even before we ask for them. So put your trust in God. Believe that He will provide your needs. Thank you for being with me. Again, I invite you to just go back and read this story, because sometimes we take these stories in the Bible for granted that, oh, I remember that, I remember that. But it's these stories that we take for granted that helps to encourage us and helps us to realize how truly good and great God is, and what a great and mighty God we serve. So I invite you to join us on Wednesday at 1:30 for Hump Day, and at 7 o'clock for midweek Bible study, and then again at 9:30 for Sunday morning worship. Thank you for having me, and may God bless you.